At 2:08 a.m., my daughter texted, "Dad, is my key still inside the black toolbox?" Her husband thought it was meaningless. He was wrong. That sentence was a secret code we had created 24 years earlier. I drove straight to her house. Her husband smiled and claimed she was asleep upstairs. Then I saw what was lying beside the stairs, and I knew my daughter was in grave danger. I'm so grateful you're here with me today on Dad's Family Stories. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I'd love to know where this story finds you. This story contains fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental, but every lesson in it is worth carrying. The phone lit up at 2:08 in the morning. I was already a light sleeper. Had been for years. Comes with the territory when you spend 3 decades reconstructing accidents from whatever scraps the scene left behind. Tire marks call logs, the angle a door swings open when someone hits it at speed. Your brain never fully powers down. It just idles, waiting for something to need it. So when the screen brightened on my nightstand, I was awake before the notification sound finished. The name on the screen was Lenora. I reached for the phone the way you reach for something you already know is going to change things. Slow, deliberate. Like those extra 2 seconds might give you time to prepare. The message read, "Dad, is my key still inside the black toolbox?" I sat up. My feet found the floor without me deciding to move them. 34 years of muscle memory from a job that punished hesitation had apparently survived retirement intact. I read the message again, then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it, because I needed a moment to accept that I was reading it at all. There was no black toolbox, not anymore. I'd thrown the original out sometime around the Clinton administration. But the phrase itself, that specific sentence, those exact words, had been sitting in the back of my memory like a fire extinguisher you hope you'll never need to use. Lenora was 11 years old the summer she got separated from me at the Mackinac County Fair. It was a Saturday in July, the kind of afternoon that smells like funnel cake and cut grass and feels like it should only exist in photographs. 1 minute she was beside me at the ring toss booth, and then the crowd shifted and she wasn't. I found her 12 minutes later near the livestock pavilion sitting on a fence post with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, refusing to cry, even though her eyes were doing everything crying does except make noise. That was Lenora. Always had been. That night after she was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and felt the particular kind of sick that only parents know. The kind that lives in your stomach even after everything turns out fine. Because I understood something that evening that I hadn't fully understood before. The world was large and indifferent, and sometimes it moved faster than a father could. So I invented the code. I told Lenora about it the next morning over pancakes. I kept my voice casual the way you have to when you're teaching a child something important, and you don't want fear to be the thing they remember. If you're ever in a situation where you can't say out loud that something's wrong, I told her, "You ask me about the key to the black toolbox." She looked at me over her orange juice. "What does it mean?" "It means 4 things," I said. "You're not safe. Someone might be watching. Don't call back. Come find me." She thought about it for a moment, chewing her pancake. Then she nodded the way she nodded when she decided to take something seriously. Lenora had always been economical with that nod. She didn't give it out for small things. That was 24 years ago. In all those years, through college, through her career, through 7 years of marriage, to a man I tried harder to like than I let on, she had never once used the code. Until 2:08 on a Tuesday morning in October. I was still staring at the message when the second one arrived. "Forget it. Vaughn found the key." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand, stood up, and walked to the closet. Here is the thing about that second message that I understood immediately, the thing that most people would have missed. Lenora does not send careless texts. She is precise the way people are precise when they've spent years working with data that has consequences: water samples, coastal surveys, environmental compliance reports, where one wrong number can cost a project 2 years and $1 million. When she means something, she says it exactly. When she doesn't mean something, she doesn't say it. She would not have sent the first message by accident, which meant the second message was not from her. Or if it was, someone was standing close enough to read her screen and make sure she sent it. Either way, only one answer made sense. Vaughn had seen it. I pulled on my jeans, my flannel shirt, my boots. I moved through the bedroom in the dark, because I knew where everything was, and I didn't need the light, and I didn't want the light. There was something clarifying about the darkness. It stripped away everything that didn't matter. I took my jacket from the hook by the door. My keys were on the kitchen counter where I always left them. My phone went into my breast pocket. I did not call Lenora back. She had told me not to. I did not call Vaughn. There was nothing he could tell me that would be worth warning him. I stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold and wet, that specific Michigan October cold that seeps through fabric like it has a personal grievance. Rain was coming down in thin, steady sheets, the kind that isn't dramatic enough to be interesting, but is thorough enough to soak you completely if you stand in it long enough. I stood in it for about 4 seconds. Then I got in the truck. Lenora lived 90 minutes north of me, outside a small lake town called Harrow's Mill. Her husband ran a company out of the marina there, restoration and transport of high-end vessels across the Great Lakes region. Expensive boats, corporate clients, the kind of business that looked impressive on paper and at dinner parties, and in the kinds of conversations where nobody asks follow-up questions. I had tried for Lenora's sake to find things to like about Vaughn Calder. Some days I'd come close. I backed out of the driveway without turning on the headlights until I reached the road. The rain swept across the windshield in long, silver lines. The highway north of Kellerton runs straight for the first 20 miles, before it starts following the lakeshore, bending left and right. The way water decides to go, not the way engineers would have preferred. I've driven that road hundreds of times. In daylight, it's the kind of drive that makes people move to Michigan pine trees, pressing close on both sides, the lake flashing silver between gaps in the tree line, the sky doing whatever it wants above all of it. At 2:30 in the morning in the rain, it's just dark and wet and yours. I kept both hands on the wheel. I kept my speed at 4 miles over the limit, which is the speed you drive when you need to get somewhere fast, but you can't afford to get pulled over and spend 20 minutes on the shoulder explaining yourself to a deputy who has no reason to believe you. I did not turn on the radio. The rain against the windshield was loud enough. I had driven about 15 minutes when the part of my brain that never stops working, the part I'd spent 32 years training and another 4 years trying to quiet in retirement, started laying out what I knew. The way I used to lay out evidence photographs on a folding table at a job site. First fact, Lenora had sent the code. That was not a mistake, and it was not a pocket dial, and it was not some strange coincidence. She had typed those exact words deliberately, which meant she had been in a situation where she needed to signal me without being able to say so directly. Second fact. The second message had followed within 2 minutes. Forget it. Vaughn found the key. Either Lenora had sent it under duress, or Vaughn had taken the phone and sent it himself. Both possibilities meant the same thing. He had been close enough to see what she'd written, close enough to intervene. Third fact, she had not tried to call me. The code specifically said not to call. She was following the rules we'd set 24 years ago, which told me she was frightened enough to remember them precisely. Those 3 facts together told me enough. The last time I'd spoken to Lenora had been Sunday evening, 2 days ago. She'd called while I was on the back porch watching the last of the light leave the lake, and we'd talked for maybe 40 minutes about nothing in particular, a restoration project she was consulting on near Traverse City, a book she'd started, and put down whether I was eating enough vegetables, which was a question she'd been asking me since her mother died, and which I'd been deflecting with the same level of success for 11 years. She had sounded tired. I'd asked her the way I always asked, whether everything was all right. "I'm fine, Dad," she'd said. "Just a lot going on." I had believed her. Sitting in the truck on that wet highway at 2:30 in the morning, I turned that conversation over in my head and looked at it from the angle I hadn't looked at it from on Sunday. Not the angle of a father who wanted his daughter to be fine. The angle of a man who'd spent 3 decades reading scenes for what they actually were, rather than what they appeared to be. She had sounded tired. Not the tired of too much work. The tired of something heavier. The tired of carrying something you've been carrying for a long time and can't put down. I had missed it. I pressed my back teeth together and kept driving. I thought about Vaughn Calder. The way I'd been thinking about him for 7 years, carefully, and with the specific discipline of a man who knows that disliking someone is not the same as having a reason to distrust them. He was 39 years old. He'd built his boat restoration company from a 2-slip operation into one of the more respected marine transport businesses on the Great Lakes. He had the handshake of a man who'd practiced it, the memory for names of someone who understood that people like to be remembered, and the particular charm of a person who had learned early that likability was a tool. The first time I met him at a dinner, Lenora arranged at a restaurant in Harrow's Mill, he'd spent 20 minutes asking me questions about my work. Not polite questions, detailed ones. He wanted to know how accident reconstruction actually functioned, how you could look at a scene after the fact and determine what had happened, who had done what the sequence of events had been. I'd answered him honestly. I'd even found myself enjoying the conversation. It was only later driving home that night that I realized he hadn't offered a single detail about himself that I hadn't directly asked for. Every question had been pointed at me. Every answer I gave had gone somewhere behind those attentive eyes and stayed there. I told myself I was being an overprotective father. I told myself that for 7 years. The lakeshore appeared on my left, black water moving under the rain, with no interest in the weather or the hour or the man driving past it, with his jaw set and his hands at 10 and 2. I thought about the barbecue last 4th of July. Vaughn manning the grill in a way that suggested he'd practiced looking relaxed while doing it. The way he'd touched Lenora's elbow to steer her toward the table, just a touch. Barely anything, the kind of gesture that looks like affection from across a yard. But she'd moved the way people move when they've been trained to respond to something. Not freely, correctly. I had noticed that. I had not known what to do with it. The sign for Harrow's Mill appeared out of the rain. 4 miles. I slowed to the posted limit without thinking about it. You don't want to come in fast. You don't want anyone, neighbors, a late-night dog walker, anyone to clock a truck moving urgently toward a specific address at 3:40 in the morning. You want to arrive the way water arrives, like you were always going to be there eventually. I turned onto Lenora's street. The houses here were cedar and stone, the kind of homes that had been expensive 20 years ago, and were now simply part of the landscape, absorbed into the tree lines and the view. Most of them were dark. A dog barked twice somewhere behind a fence and stopped. Lenora's house sat at the end of a slight curve in the road, set back from the street behind a row of white birches that had gone bare for the season. It was a renovated craftsman with a deep porch and a detached garage and a dock that extended 40 feet into the lake behind it. Every light on the ground floor was burning. I parked on the street rather than pulling into the driveway. Then I cut the engine and sat there with the rain drumming the roof of the cab, looking at those lit windows. No movement. No shadows crossing the glass. No porch light. Just the flat, even glow of every lamp in the house turned on at 3:40 in the morning. I have reconstructed enough scenes to know that the absence of something can carry as much information as its presence. Nobody had been to bed in that house tonight. I gave myself 60 seconds in the truck before I moved. Not because I needed to calm down. I was calm. I have always been calm in the moments that matter, which is either a professional asset or a personal failing, depending on who you ask. My late wife Margaret used to say I was the only man she'd ever met who got quieter when things got serious. She didn't always mean it as a compliment. I used those 60 seconds to look at the house the way I used to look at an accident scene before I stepped out of my vehicle. You take in the whole picture before you start moving through it, because once you start moving, you start disturbing things, and you can't undisturb them. Ground floor lights on? All of them. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway visible through the side light window beside the front door. No movement. No television flicker. No shadows crossing the ceiling. The garage was closed. Both vehicles in the driveway, Lenora's Subaru and Vaughn's black pickup. The porch was dark even though the porch light had a motion sensor and I was sitting 30 feet away. He'd turned the sensor off. I got out of the truck. The rain had softened to a mist that you felt more than heard, the kind that settles into your hair and your collar without announcing itself. I walked up the front path at a pace that said I had every right to be there, which I did. I stepped onto the porch and knocked. 3 times. Even. Not aggressive. The door opened in under 10 seconds. Vaughn Calder was fully dressed. Dark jeans, a charcoal Henley leather boots with the laces tied. His hair was combed. At 3:42 in the morning, the man looked like he was prepared to go somewhere or receive someone, and I understood in that instant that he had been waiting. Not sleeping. Not watching television. Waiting. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then the expression arranged itself into something that resembled surprise. Gideon. He said my name the way men say the names of people they've decided don't require full sentences. What are you doing here? Lenora texted me, I said. Something happened in his face. Very small. The kind of thing you don't see unless you've spent years looking for it. A fractional tightening around the eyes, a quarter second, where the prepared expression slipped before he caught it and put it back. She did, he said. She did. I'd like to see her. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, which is a posture that looks relaxed and is actually a way of making yourself wider in a doorway without appearing to block it. I had used that posture myself years ago when I needed to keep someone from walking into an accident scene before it was safe. She's asleep, he said. We had an argument earlier. She was upset. She's been having a hard time lately. He paused, giving that last sentence room to land. I'm sure she texted you in the middle of it and didn't mean to worry you. I'd like to see her, I said again. He exhaled through his nose, the sound of a reasonable man dealing with an unreasonable situation. Gideon, it's almost 4 in the morning. She just got to sleep an hour ago. If I go up there and wake her, then wake her. The smile stayed, but the warmth left it entirely the way a fire looks the same for a moment after you throw water on it. I understand you're her father, he said, but she's my wife, and she needs rest. Coming up here in the middle of the night every time she gets emotional. I'm not here every time, I said. I'm here this time. I looked past him then. Not obviously. The way you look past someone when you're pretending to consider what they've said, a slight shift of focus enough to take in what's behind them without making it a thing. Lenora's purse was on the chair beside the entry table. Her keys were on the table itself, the key ring with the little brass compass she'd had since graduate school. Her rain jacket, the dark green one she wore almost everywhere from September through May, was hanging from the hook at the bottom of the stairs. Her trail runners, the ones with the mud still on the soles from wherever she'd hiked last weekend, were on the mat beside the door. Purse, keys, jacket, shoes. If she'd left with a friend, she'd done it without any of the things she never left without. Then I saw something else. On the hardwood floor, half under the edge of the entry table, catching the light from the hallway, in a way that Vaughn almost certainly hadn't noticed, a thin line of silver. Curved, about 3 inches long, a broken chain. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the morning I got the call about Margaret. I knew that chain. I had fastened it around Lenora's neck myself 2 years after Margaret died, when Lenora told me she wanted to wear her mother's necklace, but was afraid she'd lose the pendant. I'd taken it to a jeweler in Petoskey and had a replacement chain made slightly heavier than the original, stronger. The jeweler had told me it was nearly impossible to break under normal circumstances. I let my eyes move from the chain to Vaughn's right wrist. He was gesturing with it, something about giving Lenora space, about how this kind of reaction was exactly the problem, about how she'd been struggling emotionally, and this wasn't helping. And they're caught in the metal bracelet of the watch on his right wrist, small enough that he hadn't felt it. Small enough that most people would never have registered it was a button. Round, pale, the color of old pearls. I had seen that button before. 2 nights ago at dinner, Lenora had been wearing a sage green blouse with pearl buttons down the front. She'd kept pulling the sleeve over her left wrist. I remembered now the way you pull a sleeve when you're covering something you don't want seen. I had noticed that too. I had told myself she was cold. Vaughn was still talking. Something about how I was making this harder. Something about how Lenora needed stability right now. Not her father showing up in the middle of the night and escalating things. I looked at him. "You're right," I said. He stopped. "I shouldn't have come by so late," I said. "I'll call her in the morning." He blinked. Twice. The surprise on his face was genuine this time. He had been prepared for an argument, and I had taken the argument away, and for a man who had prepared for a specific conversation, that kind of pivot is deeply disorienting. Yeah," he said. "That's probably best." "I'm sorry to bother you," I said. I turned and walked back down the porch steps. I walked at the same pace I'd arrived, unhurried, deliberate. I did not look back. At the end of the front path, I turned toward my truck, and I heard the door close behind me. I had everything I needed. The broken chain, the pearl button, the shoes and the keys and the purse and the jacket. The way he'd moved to fill the doorway. The way his face had shifted when I mentioned her text. I had all of it, and he had no idea. I drove exactly 4 blocks before I pulled over. There was a stretch of curb beside a closed hardware store. Dark enough that nobody would notice the truck, and close enough to Lenora's street that I could still see the glow of her house lights reflecting off the low clouds. I put the truck in park, left the engine running for the heat, and reached into the glove compartment for the small spiral notebook I'd carried in every vehicle I'd owned since 1987. Old habits don't retire just because you do. I wrote the time first. 3:51 a.m. Then I wrote down everything I had seen in the order I had seen it, with as much precision as I could hold on to. I had learned early in my career that memory is not a recording. It's a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you're rebuilding it from available materials, and the materials shift. Details that felt certain at 9 in the morning feel less certain by noon. By evening, they've started rearranging themselves to fit whatever you've learned or decided in the hours between. The solution is simple, and almost nobody does it. Write it down immediately. Write it in the present tense as if it's still happening. Don't interpret. Don't conclude. Just record. 3:51 a.m. Subject opened door within 10 seconds of knock. Fully dressed, dark jeans, charcoal Henley leather boots, laces tied, hair combed. No indication of having been asleep. 3:52 a.m. Purse, keys, rain jacket, trail shoes observed inside entry. All items L carries consistently when leaving residence. 3:53 a.m. Broken silver chain observed on floor, partially under entry table. Consistent with necklace transferred from M to L, approximately 9 years ago. Chain reinforced by jeweler not prone to accidental breakage. 3:54 a.m. Pearl button observed caught in bracelet of subject's watch right wrist. Consistent with buttons on sage blouse worn by L at dinner 2 days prior. 3:54 a.m. Subject made no offer to call L downstairs. Made no move towards staircase. Positioned body in doorway throughout conversation. 3:55 a.m. Porch motion sensor light not activated upon my approach. Sensor was functional at last visit 6 weeks ago. I read it back once. Then I underlined the last entry. A man who turns off his porch light in the middle of the night is a man who doesn't want to see who's coming. I closed the notebook, set it on the passenger seat, and picked up my phone. The Lakemont County Sheriff's non-emergency line rang twice before a dispatcher answered. She sounded alert, which meant she was either early in her shift or had enough coffee. I introduced myself by name and told her I needed to report a concern about my adult daughter. I used the word concern deliberately. Not emergency, not crisis. Concern is a word that keeps doors open without triggering defensiveness. I explained what I knew. My daughter had sent me a prearranged distress message at 2:08 a.m. A message we had established specifically for situations where she could not openly communicate that something was wrong. I had driven to her residence. Her husband had told me she left with a friend. Her purse, keys, vehicle jacket, and shoes were still inside the home. I had observed physical evidence suggesting a struggle had occurred prior to my arrival. The dispatcher asked me to hold. She came back 90 seconds later and told me a deputy would meet me at the residence within the hour. She also told me what I already knew, that under Michigan law, an adult who chooses to leave their home cannot be compelled to return, and that without evidence of a crime, the department's options were limited. I understand, I said. I'm not asking you to compel anything. I'm asking you to document what I observed. She said she would pass that along. I thanked her and ended the call. A deputy arrived at Lenora's address at 4:41. I watched from the street. He knocked, spoke with Vaughn for 11 minutes, and left. I had not expected anything different. Without physical access to the interior and without Lenora present to corroborate anything, the deputy had no grounds to do more than document the welfare check. Vaughn had told him the same story he'd told me. The deputy had written it down and driven away. That was not a failure of the system. That was the system working exactly as Vaughn had designed it to work. Documentation matters more than most people realize. Not because it immediately changes anything, but because it establishes a timeline that cannot be revised later. Vaughn could tell whatever story he wanted about tonight. But at 3:56 a.m., I had already put a version of events on record with the county sheriff's office. If his story and my documentation conflicted, and someone was going to have to explain the discrepancy. The rain had picked up again. I watched it move through the beam of a streetlight 2 blocks down, falling in long diagonal lines, the way it does when the wind comes off the lake. I thought about Lenora somewhere in it. I thought about whether she was cold. I made myself stop thinking about that. At 5:15, with the sky beginning to consider the idea of light without actually committing to it, I drove to the east side of Lenora's street and parked facing the house. The ground floor lights were still on. No movement. No additional vehicles. At 5:43, I drove 2 streets over to a pale yellow craftsman with a ceramic rooster on the porch and a wind chime made of old silverware hanging beside the door. I had been to this house once before, 2 summers ago, when Lenora had introduced me to her neighbor at a block party. The woman had brought a lemon cake and known the names of every tree in the immediate vicinity. I knocked. It took about a minute. Then the porch light came on, hers was working fine, and the door opened on a chain. One eye and part of a silver-haired face appeared in the gap. Mr. Rourke. Her voice was cautious but not frightened. The voice of someone who had decided at some point in their life that being frightened was less useful than being careful. Mrs. Finch, I said. I'm sorry for the hour. I need to ask you about last night. Marlowe Finch was 64 years old, a retired high school biology teacher who had lived across from Lenora for 6 years and who noticed things the way people notice things when they've spent decades watching teenagers try to hide what they're actually doing. She unlatched the chain without hesitation, which told me she'd already been thinking about whether to call someone. She had a pot of coffee going in the kitchen. She poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the table between us. I was going to call the non-emergency line this morning, she said. I kept talking myself out of it. Tell me what you saw, I said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Outside, the rain tapped against the kitchen window in an uneven rhythm, and Marlowe Finch looked at her coffee and took a breath. Last night, she said, around 1:30 or so, I heard the garage door from across the street. She looked up at me. That wasn't the first time I'd seen something wrong at that house, Mr. Rourke. Marlowe Finch drank her coffee, the way people drink coffee when they're using it to organize their thoughts rather than to wake up. Small sips, long pauses between them. Her eyes moved to the window and back to the window and back like she was checking to make sure the street was still there. Une seconde, she said. A Thursday evening. I was coming back from my sister's place in Bel Air later than I meant to be. Maybe 9:30. I turned onto our street and my headlights caught them in the driveway. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Take your time, I said. He had her by the arm. She said it quickly, the way you say something you've been holding in your mouth too long. Vaughn. He had Lenora by the upper arm and he wasn't hitting her. He was steering her. The way you'd steer someone who wasn't going where you wanted them to go. She was pulling away from him and he was just... She shook her head, tightening his grip, like it wasn't even an effort. My hand was flat on the table. I kept it flat. What happened next? I slowed down. I almost stopped. And then he looked up and saw my headlights, and he let go of her arm, and he smiled at me. Her voice shifted on that last word. Thinned out. Like we'd just happened to be in the same place at the same time. Like I hadn't seen anything. And Lenora, she turned and she waved at me. This little wave. Normal as anything. But it wasn't normal, I said. Her face wasn't. Marlowe set her mug down and looked at me directly for the first time since she'd started talking. Her eyes were steady and a little angry, which I respected more than I would have respected tears. Her face was the face of someone who has learned very carefully how to look fine. There's a difference, Mr. Rourke. I taught high school for 31 years. I know the difference. I believed her completely. Did you speak to her after that? I asked. I tried. 2 days later, I caught her getting the mail, and I asked if everything was okay. She said yes. She said Vaughn, and she had just been having a disagreement, and it was nothing to worry about. Marlo's jaw tightened. And then the following week, Vaughn came to my door. Tell me about that. She picked her mug back up, held it without drinking. He was very pleasant about it. That's what I keep thinking about, how pleasant he was. He said he understood I might have seen something that looked concerning, and he wanted to explain. He said Lenora had been struggling with her mental health, anxiety, sleep problems, episodes where she became irrational and sometimes physical. He said she was getting help, but that it was a difficult process, and that outside interference, even well-meaning interference, could set her back significantly. He used the word interference, I said. He did. And then he said he hoped I understood that what happens between a husband and wife is a private matter, and that getting involved in things I didn't fully understand could cause real harm to someone I clearly cared about. She looked at me over the rim of her mug. He never raised his voice. He never threatened me directly. But I understood exactly what he meant. I had interviewed hundreds of witnesses over the course of my career. Witnesses who had seen accidents, witnessed confrontations, observed things they wished they hadn't. The ones who stayed silent rarely did so because they didn't care. They stayed silent because someone had taken the time to explain to them in calm and reasonable language exactly what silence was worth. Vaughn had done his homework. Last night, I said, tell me what you saw. Marlo set down her coffee and folded her hands on the table. I couldn't sleep. Hadn't been sleeping well since that Thursday. I was up reading around 1:30 when I heard the garage door across the street. Our houses face each other directly, so sound carries. I went to the window. She paused. There was an SUV parked with its rear end toward the garage. Dark-colored. I didn't recognize it at first. Then I remembered I'd seen it in the driveway before. It belongs to a man named Silas. He's been to the house a few times. Vaughn's friend from way back, I think. Silas Creed, I said. She nodded. Vaughn and this Silas, they were bringing someone out through the garage. A woman. She had a long coat on, dark-colored, and she was... Marlo stopped, pressed 3 fingers briefly to her mouth. She wasn't walking right. Not like she was hurt exactly. More like she wasn't entirely present. Like she needed to be held up. The skin on my forearms went tight under my sleeves. I opened my window, Marlo continued. Just a little. And right before they got her to the car, right before the door closed, I heard her voice. She looked at me. Her eyes were steady and wet and furious. She said, Vaughn, stop, clear as anything. That was Lenora's voice. I've heard it for 6 years. I know her voice. The kitchen was very quiet except for the rain. You're certain, I said. Not a question. I am, she said. And I should have called someone right then. I know that. I picked up my phone and I put it down again, and I kept thinking about what he'd said, about interference, about not fully understanding, and I hate that I let that stop me. I hate it very much. Mrs. Finch. I waited until she looked at me. You're telling me now. That matters. She nodded once, pulled herself together the way people pull themselves together when they've decided that feeling bad about something is a luxury they can't currently afford. I called Deputy Nolan Vey directly. I'd gotten his number from the dispatcher earlier and told him I had a witness with direct testimony placing Lenora in a vehicle against her will at approximately 1:35 a.m. That changed things considerably. Under Michigan law, a witness account of a person being removed from a location while audibly objecting is sufficient grounds to escalate a missing person report to a criminal investigation. Nolan said he'd be there in 20 minutes. While we waited, Marlo remembered something else. "There's one more thing," she said slowly, like she wasn't sure whether to say it. "About 3 months ago, late at night, maybe 2 in the morning, I happened to look out my bedroom window and the light was on in their upstairs room. And Lenora was standing at the window." She stopped. "She was just standing there," Marlo said, "looking out at the street. And then she looked across, and she saw me in my window. And she raised her hand." Marlo lifted her own hand, a small, deliberate wave, fingers barely moving. "Like that. And then she stepped back into the room and the light went off." I sat with that for a moment. All those months my daughter had been standing at windows in the middle of the night, raising her hand at the one neighbor she thought might be watching, learning how to ask for help in a language she hadn't been taught yet. Deputy Nolan Vey arrived at Marlo's house at 6:14 and spent 40 minutes taking her statement. He was younger than I expected, early 30s, with the careful, slightly formal manner of someone who had learned that being underestimated was a liability he couldn't afford. He listened without interrupting, wrote everything down by hand, and asked follow-up questions that told me he understood which details mattered. When he finished with Marlo, he stepped onto the porch with me. "The witness account is significant," he said. "An audible objection from the individual prior to being placed in a vehicle that's not nothing. I'm going to kick this upstairs and see if we can get a camera pull on the traffic systems between here and the county line. There's something else I need to check," I told him. "At my own residence. If I find what I think I'm going to find, I'll call you immediately." He looked at me the way young deputies look at retired investigators, not quite sure whether to be deferential or cautious. He settled on direct. "Don't touch anything you find, Mr. Rourke." "I know," I said. I drove south. The 90 minutes back felt nothing like the 90 minutes up. Going towards something unknown is one kind of drive. Going back through daylight with a clearer picture of what you're looking for is something else entirely. The rain had stopped. The highway was pale and wet and mostly empty, and I drove it with the window cracked an inch because I needed the cold air and the sound of the tires on the wet asphalt to keep my mind ordered. I kept returning to a conversation from 3 weeks ago. Lenora had come down for a Sunday afternoon. Nothing special she did, that occasionally just showed up with a bag of groceries and cooked something while I sat at the kitchen counter and got in her way. We'd eaten early and then sat on the back porch, watching the lake go gray in the early evening. And at some point she'd asked casually, the way she asked things she didn't want to seem important, whether I still kept my old tools in the garage. I had said yes. She'd asked if the garage was still unlocked during the day. I had said yes to that too. I hadn't thought about it again. She'd changed the subject within seconds, moved on to something about a project she was consulting on near the Sleeping Bear Dunes, and I'd let it go because she'd seemed to want me to let it go. Now I understood that she had been telling me something in the only way she safely could. She had been planting a location. I pulled into my driveway at 8:30 in the morning. The garage was a detached structure at the back of the property, weathered cedar siding, the kind of building that accumulates decades of objects without ever being properly organized. Lawn equipment along the left wall, a workbench along the back. Metal shelving units on the right, holding paint cans, extension cords, a shop vac, spare window screens, 3 decades of miscellaneous hardware sorted into coffee cans by size. I went straight to the shelving units. The bottom shelf on the far right was the one I used. Least it held overflow items, things I kept meaning to sort through and never did. Behind a stack of old storm window frames pushed far enough back that you'd need to know it was there to find it was a toolbox. Black metal, 12 inches long, a latching handle on top. It was not mine. I crouched in front of it for a moment without touching it. The latch was clean. No dust on the surface, which meant it had been placed here recently. The paint was unscratched, brand new or close to it. My daughter had bought a black toolbox and driven it to my garage 3 weeks ago and hidden it behind the storm window frames on the bottom shelf I never used. And she had done it without telling me. Because she couldn't tell me, because telling me would have meant explaining why. And explaining why would have meant saying things out loud that she wasn't safe to say out loud. I called Thaddeus Wynne. Thaddeus had been my wife Margaret's attorney for the last decade of her life, and mine since then, a compact, deliberate man of 66 who wore the same style of half-frame reading glasses he'd been wearing since I met him, and who had the particular quality of good lawyers everywhere, which is that he made you feel like whatever you were about to tell him was something he had already heard a version of and was not going to be alarmed by. "I need you to come to my house," I said when he answered. "I found something, and I need it handled correctly." "Give me 40 minutes, he said. He didn't ask what it was. That was one of the things I valued about Thaddeus. I waited on the porch. I did not go back into the garage. I did not open the toolbox. I understood what was at stake with physical evidence. Chain of custody is not a bureaucratic formality. It is the difference between evidence that can be used in court and evidence that cannot. If I opened that toolbox and handled its contents, a defense attorney could argue that I had altered, contaminated, or selectively presented what was inside. Anything Lenora had risked herself to preserve could be rendered inadmissible by 30 seconds of impatience on my part. I sat on the porch and watched a pair of mergansers work their way along the shoreline, and I did not go into the garage. Thaddeus arrived in 38 minutes. He came around to the garage with me, looked at the toolbox on the shelf without touching it, and said, "You didn't open it." "No." "Good man." He took out his phone and called a contact at the county sheriff's office directly, not the non-emergency line, a name he knew personally. He explained the situation in 4 sentences. Evidence potentially connected to an ongoing missing persons investigation located at a private residence, owner of the residence present, and cooperative requesting an evidence technician to document and take custody of the item and its contents. They sent someone within the hour. While we waited, I told Thaddeus everything, from the text message at 2:08 in the morning, to Marlowe's statement, to the broken chain on Lenora's floor, to the pearl button on Vaughn's watch. I told it in order the way I would have written it up, and Thaddeus listened the way he always listened, without expression, with complete attention, occasionally writing a single word in the small leather notebook he carried in his breast pocket. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She planned this, Gideon." "I know," I said. "She planned it carefully, and she executed it under conditions that most people couldn't have managed." He looked at me. "She gets that from somewhere." The evidence technician arrived, documented the toolbox in situ, and transported it along with its contents. Thaddeus and I followed to the sheriff's office, where a copy was made for our review before the originals were logged into evidence. It was not until I was sitting in a small conference room with a laptop and the copied drive that I understood the full scope of what my daughter had built inside that black toolbox. The first image that opened on the screen made my breath stop in my chest. Before I show you what was inside that drive, what my daughter had been quietly building while living inside that house, drop a 1 in the comments right now, so I know you're still here with me. Every number tells me this story is reaching someone who needs it. And a quick note, what follows includes some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. If that's not for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. The first image was her left forearm. I had held that arm thousands of times over 35 years. When she was small enough to carry, when she learned to ride a bicycle on the gravel path behind our house on Kellerton Lake, when I walked her across the stage at her doctoral hooding ceremony, and she'd grabbed my arm with both hands because she was more nervous than she'd admitted. I knew that arm the way you know something you've touched your whole life without thinking about it. The bruise ran from the inside of her elbow to her wrist. Yellow-green at the edges, which meant it was at least a week old when she photographed it. Deep purple at the center, the kind of bruising that comes from sustained pressure rather than a single impact. In the corner of the image, handwritten on a small piece of paper held just inside the frame, were a date and 3 words. He said I fell. I looked at that image for a long time. Thaddeus sat beside me and did not say anything, which was the right thing to do. Then I turned to the next file. Lenora had organized the USB with the same precision she brought to everything, folders labeled by category, files named by date, nothing out of sequence. She had been building this for weeks, possibly longer. The photographs alone numbered 31, spanning 4 months, each one documenting something she had hidden under long sleeves and careful positioning and the performance of being fine. Some of them I could look at directly. Some of them I had to look at the way you look at something very bright, briefly, at an angle, then away. After the photographs came the financial documents. I was not an accountant, and I didn't need to be. The pattern was clear enough. Vaughn's company, Calder Marine Transport, maintained records for a storage facility. It operated out of a secondary location on the south end of the marina. According to the official documentation, this facility housed vessels undergoing restoration between transport contracts. According to the invoices Lenora had copied, it had been generating substantial repair and materials costs for 18 consecutive months. What it had not been generating, according to a separate set of records Lenora had pulled from the county assessor's database, was any actual vessel traffic. The slip logs showed the facility essentially dormant. Equipment costs billed to insurance carriers for machinery that either didn't exist or hadn't moved. It was a straightforward insurance billing scheme, the kind that works until someone with access to both sets of records decides to put them side by side. Vaughn had apparently not considered that his wife, who spent her professional life cross-referencing environmental compliance documents, might bring that same habit home. After the financial records came the messages. Lenora had taken screenshots of text exchanges between Vaughn and Silas Creed going back 8 months. Most of them were operational logistics schedules amounts. Careful language, the kind of careful that tells you the writers knew they were creating a record and were trying to make it look innocuous. But several were not careful at all, the way people stop being careful when they're angry or confident or both. Then the audio file. Thaddeus leaned forward slightly when I opened it. The recording was 43 seconds long. The sound quality was uneven. Lenora had clearly captured it on her phone from a distance, possibly from another room, possibly through a partially open door. There was ambient noise, a television somewhere, the clink of something glass. Then Silas Creed's voice, low and unhurried. She keeps pushing on this. You're going to have a problem. You need to get ahead of it. Make the narrative yours before she makes it hers. Vaughn's voice. She won't go to anyone. She knows what that looks like. She went to a lawyer 3 months ago. Did you know that? Pause. I found out, Vaughn said. Then you know she's further along than you thought. If she won't cooperate, you make everyone around her believe she's losing her mind. You've already started. Keep going. By the time she says anything, nobody's going to know what to believe. Another pause. Longer. Her father's the only one who might listen, Vaughn said. And he's just an old man. He'll believe whatever I tell him. He always has. The recording ended. I reached over and closed the laptop. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "The recording is admissible. Michigan is a one-party consent state, meaning only one person in a conversation needs to agree to the recording for it to be legal. Since Lenora was present, she captured it herself in a location where she had a right to be. There's no legal issue with its use." I nodded. I had known that. I had needed him to say it anyway, because hearing it said out loud, by someone other than the voice in my own head, made it real in a way it hadn't quite been yet. "He believed it," I said. "What's that?" "What he said. About me." I looked at the closed laptop. He wasn't performing for Silas. There was no reason to perform. He believed it. Thaddeus didn't offer me a contradiction, which I appreciated. False comfort would have been an insult to both of us. I opened the laptop again and moved to the last folder. It was labeled simply, "Check this." Inside were 3 documents. 2 were insurance filings, claim submissions for a storage facility fire that had occurred 8 months prior. The third was a spreadsheet Lenora had built herself, cross-referencing dates. I scanned it once. Then I looked more carefully at the column on the far right, where she had highlighted a single cell in yellow. The insurance coverage on the facility had been increased substantially, almost doubled, 19 days before the fire. I sat back in my chair. In 32 years of reconstructing accidents, I had learned that fires are among the most difficult events to definitively characterize. They consume evidence. They alter scenes. They give investigators very little to work with, which is precisely why they are sometimes chosen by people who need an event to look like something other than what it was. 8 months ago, a fire at Vaughn's secondary storage facility had been ruled an electrical accident. I had not been involved in that investigation. I had no reason to have been. But I had been involved in something else. I scrolled back through the financial documents, moving more slowly now, looking at company names in the transaction records rather than the figures. Looking for something I hadn't been looking for before. I found it on the 4th page. The name of the original company, the one Calder Marine Transport had absorbed 4 years ago when Vaughn expanded. His operation was listed in the header of an old invoice. I knew that name. My chest did something complicated that I didn't have a word for. I knew that company name because I had typed it myself 11 years ago into the header of a 30-page accident reconstruction report that I had signed, reviewed, and submitted to a marine insurance carrier in Grand Rapids. A report that had concluded the incident was accidental. A report that had closed the case. I opened the laptop again and pulled up the invoice header. Harrow Point Marine Holdings. That was the name. 11 years ago, it had been a mid-sized vessel brokerage, operating out of 2 locations on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. A legitimate company with legitimate clients and a fleet of working boats, and apparently a subsidiary operation that was not entirely legitimate. The insurance carrier had hired me to reconstruct a collision incident involving one of their insured vessels. A commercial fishing boat had struck a moored craft in low visibility conditions near the Charlevoix Channel. 1 serious injury. Significant property damage. A disputed liability claim worth close to $400,000. I had spent 11 days on that case. I remembered it the way I remembered most of my cases. Not the way you remember a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, but the way you remember a physical space. The smell of the dock. The angle of the damage on the moored vessel's hull. A particular set of mooring lines that had been replaced shortly before the incident, which had struck me as worth noting, and which I had noted in a subordinate clause on page 14 of my report, and then proceeded past. I had concluded the collision was the result of navigational error in poor conditions. The claim was paid. The case was closed. What I had not known, what I had no way of knowing at the time, was that Harrow Point Marine Holdings was majority-owned by a then 28-year-old named Vaughn Calder, operating under a parent company registered in his mother's name. The subsidiary business, the one with the mooring lines that had been recently replaced, the one where the incident had occurred, had collected a settlement that was, I now understood, roughly twice what the actual damage would have warranted. I had handed Vaughn Calder his first successful insurance fraud and signed my name to the document that made it official. I sat with that for a long time. Thaddeus watched me. He had the good sense not to speak. Finally, I said he was 28. Lenora was 23. I turned the math over. She met him 2 weeks after I closed that file, at a conference in Traverse City. She called me that evening and said she'd met someone interesting. You couldn't have known, Thaddeus said. No. I agreed. But he could have. If he knew my name from the investigation and he would have my name was on the report, he would have known exactly who her father was by the time she introduced us. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. You think the introduction wasn't accidental? See, I think a man who has demonstrated repeatedly that he plans things carefully probably didn't stumble into a relationship with the daughter of the investigator who cleared his company's fraudulent insurance claim. I closed the laptop. I think he looked at Lenora and saw someone useful, someone whose professional credentials gave him cover and whose family connection gave him insurance. I heard myself say it and felt the specific nausea that comes not from being wrong, but from being right about something you desperately wished you were wrong about. She can't know this yet, I said. Thaddeus understood immediately. She has enough to process. If there's ever a time to tell her, she'll decide when that is. Not me. He nodded. I stood up and walked to the window of the small conference room. The parking lot below was ordinary and well lit, and completely indifferent to everything that had just shifted inside me. A woman was loading groceries into a minivan. A teenager on a bicycle cut across the far end of the lot. The world was proceeding at its usual pace, unaware that I was standing one floor above it, trying to locate the boundary between what I was responsible for and what I was not. It took me about 2 minutes. Then I turned around. What else did you find? I asked Thaddeus. He had been working while I stood at the window. He looked up from his notes. I had a colleague run a search on Vaughn's legal consultations. Not the content that's protected. But billing records for a husband and wife are marital property in Michigan, which means Lenora had access to them, and so through the documents she copied, do we. He turned his notepad toward me. 4 weeks ago, Vaughn had paid a consultation fee to a family law attorney in Petoskey. The billing description listed 3 items: asset division in the event of marital dissolution, procedures for establishing diminished mental capacity in a spouse, accessing jointly held accounts when one party is deemed unable to manage financial decisions. I read it twice. He wasn't reacting to something she did, I said. No, Thaddeus said. He was preparing for something he planned to do. The distinction mattered enormously. A husband who consults a lawyer after a confrontation is managing a crisis. A husband who consults a lawyer about his wife's mental capacity 4 weeks before she disappears is executing a strategy. The first is reactive. The second is premeditated. In a courtroom, that difference is the distance between a domestic dispute and a calculated campaign. There's something else, Thaddeus said. He flipped a page. 3 months ago, Lenora booked a room at a motel in Gaylord. Reservation under her maiden name. Rourke, paid with a prepaid card. I looked at him. She never checked in, he said. The reservation was canceled the following day. No reason given. She had tried to leave. She had saved money, made a reservation under a name Vaughn wouldn't immediately search, used a card he couldn't trace. She had gotten that far, and then she hadn't gotten any further. "He found out," I said. "That would be consistent with what came after," Thaddeus said quietly. "The increased monitoring, the escalation. Someone who discovers their partner trying to leave doesn't relax. They tighten." My phone rang. Deputy Nolan Vey. I answered before the second ring finished. "Mr. Rourke," he said. "We pulled the audio from Mrs. Finch's doorbell camera. There's something on it you need to hear." Thaddeus and I drove to the sheriff's substation on Millbrook Road, where Deputy Vey was waiting with a department laptop and a look on his face that told me the audio was not nothing. The conference room smelled like burned coffee and dry erase markers. Vey set the laptop on the table between us, pulled up the file, and hit play without preamble. The doorbell camera footage was what you'd expect from a residential unit on a rainy night, grainy, overexposed around the streetlight. The kind of image quality that gives you shapes and movement, but not faces. Marlowe's front porch faced directly across the street to Lenora's property. At the bottom left of the frame, you could see the edge of the garage apron, the pale concrete wet and shining. The timestamp read 1:34 a.m. For the first 11 seconds, nothing moved. Then the garage door began to open. The interior light came on a rectangle of yellow in the lower left of the frame. Two figures emerged, then a third moving differently from the other two. Slower, unevenly. Supported on one side, the audio was cleaner than the video. Residential doorbell cameras often prioritize sound pickup because that's what they're designed to capture someone speaking at the door. Marlowe's unit had a directional microphone that in the stillness of a wet night, with no traffic and no wind, had picked up more than she'd realized. I heard the sound of a vehicle door, the scrape of something being shifted in the rear cargo area. A man's voice, low, practical, the voice of someone managing logistics. Then Silas Creed from somewhere near the garage apron, close enough to the street that the microphone caught it cleanly. "We have to reach North Point before daylight." 6 words. Deputy Vey paused the playback. "North Point," I said. "You know it. Vaughn had a secondary storage operation there. Leased warehouse space near the harbor. He closed it officially about 14 months ago, but Lenora's financial documents show lease payments continuing for 8 months after the listed closure date." I looked at Vey. "He didn't close it. He just stopped reporting it." Vey was already writing. "North Point Harbor. That's across the state line." "Wisconsin," Thaddeus said. He had his phone out. "If they transported her across a state line against her will, that's not a local matter anymore. That triggers the federal kidnapping statute. 18 U.S. Code Section 1201. The FBI has jurisdiction." I knew the statute. Everyone who had spent any time near law enforcement knew it. Federal law on this point is straightforward. The moment you move a person across a state line without their consent, and with criminal intent, you have committed a federal offense. It does not matter how far across the line. It does not matter how long they were held. The line itself is what changes everything. The floor sentence is 20 years. There is no upper limit. What that meant practically was that Deputy Vey could no longer run this investigation from a county substation on Millbrook Road. It meant phone calls to the FBI field office in Grand Rapids. It meant a different kind of machinery with different reach and different authority. It also meant that Vaughn Calder, who had spent years carefully keeping his operations within boundaries, he understood had made a serious miscalculation. Vey stepped out to make calls. Thaddeus and I sat across from each other at the table. "He thought the state line gave him distance," I said. "It gave him the opposite," Thaddeus said. "I turned that over." Vaughn had sent Silas across the state line because distance felt like safety. A different jurisdiction, a different set of responding agencies, a buffer of geography between what happened in his house on a Tuesday night and anyone who might ask questions. What he hadn't accounted for was that crossing that line didn't diffuse the situation. It federalized it. I thought about the recording from the USB. Silas saying, "Make everyone believe she's losing her mind." Vaughn saying her father's just an old man. The plan had been careful. In some ways, it had been patient. Weeks of preparation, of building a narrative, of consulting lawyers, and saying the right things to the right neighbors. Vaughn was not impulsive. He was the kind of person who thought several moves ahead and trusted that the people around him, including the people he underestimated, would behave predictably. That was the flaw in careful plans built on underestimation. They depend on the underestimated person behaving the way you've decided they will. Vay came back in 20 minutes. He had the particular energy of someone who has just gotten off several phone calls that escalated faster than expected. "FBI field office is looping in," he said. "They're treating it as a potential federal kidnapping pending confirmation of the transport. They want everything we have, the USB contents, Mrs. Finch's statement, the camera footage, the timeline." He looked at me. "They also want to know about your background in accident reconstruction and whether you have documentation of your observations from last night." I took the spiral notebook from my breast pocket and set it on the table. Vay looked at it. "That's from last night. Starting at 3:51 this morning," I said. "Time-stamped entries. Everything I observed at the residence and everything said during my conversation with Vaughn." He picked it up carefully, the way people handle things they recognize as significant. "Can I get this copied? That's why I brought it." While Vay arranged for the notebook to be copied and the digital evidence to be transferred, Thaddeus leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "There's a problem with the timeline," he said. "Silas left at 1:52 according to traffic cameras. Vaughn was still at the house when you arrived at 3:40. That's nearly 2 hours he was alone in that house. If he spent that time destroying records, then some of what Lenora documented may already be gone," I said. "Yes, I thought about Lenora's organizational system on that USB. The labeled folders, the dated files, the highlighted cell in the spreadsheet. She had understood when she built that there might come a point where the originals were no longer available. She had built a record specifically because she anticipated that Vaughn would attempt to erase one. She had been right about that too. My daughter had prepared for the version of events where everything went wrong. What she hadn't been able to prepare for was the version where her father sat in a county substation conference room and wished with everything he had that he could take back one subordinate clause on page 14 of a 30-page report written 11 years ago. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. 2 words and a string of coordinates. "She's alive." I showed the message to Thaddeus first, then to Vay, who came back into the room 40 seconds after I called his name. 2 words. A string of GPS coordinates, sent from a number with a Wisconsin area code that when Vay ran it immediately came back as a prepaid device purchased 3 weeks ago at a gas station outside Marinette. No registered owner. No call history beyond this single outgoing text. "She bought it," I said. "Probably across the state line. She consults on projects near the Wisconsin border regularly. She's been to Marinette County 4 times in the last year alone. Cash purchase, prepaid, no name required. She would have done it somewhere Vaughn had no reason to check." Vay looked up from his screen. "We don't know that." "We will," I said. "She bought a prepaid motel room under her maiden name 3 months ago," I said. "She built a backup drive and hid it in my garage. She photographed her injuries with date stamps. She made a recording. I looked at the coordinates on my phone screen. She bought a prepaid phone and kept it somewhere Vaughn couldn't find it. And when she had 30 seconds alone, she used it. Vay was already on his radio. The coordinates placed the signal origin at a location 2 miles north of North Point Harbor, Wisconsin, a stretch of shoreline that, according to the county GIS database Thaddeus pulled up on his phone, contained 3 structures: a decommissioned fish processing plant, a private boat storage facility, and a leased warehouse registered to a shell company that, when you looked at the registered agent's name and cross-referenced it against Calder Marine Transport's corporate filings, resolved into something that was not a coincidence. Vaughn had never closed the North Point operation. He had just moved it into a different name. The FBI agent who arrived at the substation 40 minutes later was a woman named Reyes, compact, precise, with the particular quality of federal investigators who have learned that the fastest way through a situation is accurate information delivered without decoration. She reviewed everything in under 20 minutes. The USB contents, Marlowe's statement, the camera audio, the financial records, the coordinates. Then she looked at me. "You're the father," she said. "I am. Former accident reconstructionist, marine and transit insurance. 32 years. She nodded once, the way people nod when they're filing something, rather than responding to it. "The coordinates are consistent with the warehouse location. We're coordinating with the Marinette County Sheriff and the Wisconsin State Patrol. We'll have eyes on the location within the hour." She paused. "You'll stay here?" It was not phrased as a question. "I understand," I said. She held my gaze for a moment, apparently checking whether I meant it. Then she moved on. It was during the 20 minutes that followed the procedural machinery of a federal operation beginning to turn phone calls and radio checks and the specific focused quiet of people doing precise work under pressure that Vaughn made his move. Thaddeus's phone rang first. He listened for 90 seconds, said 2 words, and ended the call. "Vaughn's attorney contacted my office," he said. "They've sent a letter." He turned the phone screen toward me. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph established that Vaughn Calder denied all allegations and characterized the current investigation as the result of a mentally unstable individual's paranoid accusations facilitated by a grief-driven father operating outside his area of competence. The second paragraph was the one that mattered. It referenced a specific insurance arbitration case from 11 years ago, in which my reconstruction report had been subsequently challenged by independent analysis, resulting in a partial reversal of the original settlement. It noted that my professional conclusions had been found unreliable by a panel of industry arbiters, and that any evidence chain involving my participation or judgment should be viewed accordingly. The third paragraph suggested that continued involvement by a discredited investigator could expose the county to significant liability. I read it twice, then I said, "He's been sitting on that for 11 years. Thaddeus said, "He may have had it prepared for some time, in case he ever needed it. In case I ever became a problem." Yes, I sat back in my chair. The arbitration case was real. 3 years after I filed the original report, the claimant's insurer had hired a second firm to review my methodology. They had found that I had underweighted a specific variable in my velocity calculations, a legitimate critique, one I had ultimately agreed with, and the settlement had been partially revised. It was the kind of thing that happens in technical fields. It was also the kind of thing that looks very different when someone frames it as evidence of fundamental unreliability rather than a methodological disagreement. Vaughn had taken a professional footnote and sharpened it into a weapon. "Does it affect anything?" I asked Thaddeus. "Not the physical evidence," he said. "Not the USB, the photographs, the financial records, the audio. Not Mrs. Finch's eyewitness account. Not the camera footage. Your notebook documents your observations, not your conclusions, and your observations have been corroborated at every point by independent sources. He looked at me steadily. What it affects is the story he's trying to tell. He wants anyone listening to hear discredited investigator instead of concerned father. Let him, I said. Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. The man using my professional history to undermine me, I said, is the same man whose boat company I accidentally cleared 11 years ago. If that comes out in a courtroom, and it will, the jury isn't going to wonder whether I'm credible. They're going to wonder why he worked so hard to discredit the one person who had reason to look closely at him. Deputy Vey came back into the room. He had the careful expression of someone about to say something he'd been asked to say carefully. Mr. Rourke, he said, there's something I should have told you earlier. About Vaughn Calder. I waited. 2 years ago, he said. November, we got a noise complaint from a neighbor 2 houses down from your daughter's address. Reported sounds of a domestic argument elevated. I responded. He stopped, pressed his lips together. Vaughn answered the door. He was calm. Completely calm. Said they'd had the television up too loud. Your daughter was standing behind him. She confirmed it. She smiled, I said. He looked at me. Yeah, she did. And you wrote it up as a false alarm. I had no grounds for anything else. She wasn't showing distress. There were no visible injuries. She didn't ask for help. He stopped again. I should have followed up. I looked at this young deputy who had done exactly what his training and the law allowed him to do, and was carrying the weight of it anyway. You did what the situation permitted, I said. Vaughn spent months making sure that's all the situation would permit. That's not your failure. That's his design. Vey nodded. He didn't look relieved, which told me he was the kind of officer who would be useful in this work for a long time. Agent Reyes appeared in the doorway. We have visual confirmation on the warehouse, she said. The SUV registered to Silas Creed is on the property. Agent Reyes left the room to coordinate the approach on North Point. She had told us before she left that tactical entry on a federal kidnapping warrant typically takes 2 to 4 hours. To fully coordinate across jurisdictions, the Marinette County Sheriff needed to be looped in, the Wisconsin State Patrol needed a liaison, and nobody moved on a structure with a potential hostage inside until everyone understood their position and their radio channel and what they were not going to do. 2 to 4 hours. I understood the necessity. I hated every minute of it. Thaddeus put his hand briefly on my forearm. Let them work, he said. You've given them everything they need. Let them use it. He was right. I knew he was right. Knowing something is right and being able to sit still while it happens are 2 entirely different skills, and I had always been better at the first than the second. I picked up my phone and looked at the name Vey had given me before he stepped out. Corbin Shaw, 46 years old. Former operations supervisor at Calder Marine Transport, employed for 6 years before resigning 8 months ago, 2 weeks after the warehouse fire. He lived in a rental house on the east side of Harrow's Mill, approximately 4 miles from where I was sitting. Lenora had circled his name in her notes. Not underlined. Circled. The way you mark something that matters more than the things around it. I told Thaddeus where I was going and asked him to call me the moment anything changed on the North Point situation. Then I drove east. Corbin Shaw's rental was a single-story house with aluminum siding, the color of old pewter, and a truck in the driveway that had seen better decades. I knocked. He answered after a long pause, long enough that I suspected he'd looked through the window first, and spent the intervening time deciding whether to pretend he wasn't home. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that come from years of physical work and a face that had settled into a permanent expression of careful caution. He looked at me the way people look at someone they've been half expecting and fully dreading. "Mr. Rourke," he said. He knew my name, which meant Lenora had told him I might come, which meant she had planned for this too. "You know why I'm here?" I said. He stepped back from the door without answering, which was its own kind of answer. I followed him into a living room that smelled like coffee and sawdust. He sat on the edge of a wooden chair. I took the couch across from him. He laced his fingers together and looked at them for a moment. "Is she okay?" he asked. His voice was rough, not from emotion, from the particular hoarseness of someone who has been holding something tightly for a long time and is finally letting go. "We don't know yet," I said. "We know where she is. We're getting her out." I looked at him directly. "Tell me about the fire." He exhaled through his nose. A long, slow breath. "I've been sitting on this for 8 months, he said. 8 months of telling myself it wasn't enough, that I wasn't sure, that getting involved in something I couldn't prove would only get me hurt and wouldn't help anyone. What changed? She came to see me, he said. 3 weeks ago, Lenora. She drove to my house in the middle of the Tuesday afternoon, and she sat right where you're sitting, and she told me what she'd found in the financial records. And she said..." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "She said she wasn't asking me to go to the police. She said she understood why I hadn't. She just wanted to know if what she'd put together was right." "Was it?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "It was right." He stood up and went to the kitchen. He came back with a manila envelope that had clearly been opened and resealed multiple times, the flap worn soft from handling. He set it on the coffee table between us and didn't touch it again, the way you set down something you've been carrying too long and aren't entirely sure you should be relieved to put down. Inside were photographs printed on standard copy paper, slightly grainy. A series of interior shots of a warehouse space, shelving units, equipment bays, storage racks. Dated in the bottom right corner. And separate from the photographs, a chain of text messages printed on 3 pages and 2 pages of handwritten shift schedules. 9 days before the fire, Corbin said Vaughn came to me directly. Not through Silas, which was unusual. Silas handled most of the day-to-day. Vaughn came himself, which meant it was something he didn't want going through anyone else first. He nodded at the photographs. He told me to move a specific set of equipment out of Bay 4. Fuel transfer pumps. A set of portable tanks, the kind you use for on-water refueling. Some electrical testing equipment. High-value items insured separately from the general facility policy. He wanted them out of Bay 4 specifically, I said. He said Bay 4 was getting reorganized. He needed the space. Corbin looked at me. Bay 4 was the bay with the oldest wiring in the building. I knew that because I'd flagged it in a maintenance report 6 months earlier. I'd asked about getting it updated. Silas told me it wasn't in the budget. I let the silence do its work. I moved the equipment, Corbin said. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, that it was exactly what he'd said, it was a reorganization. His jaw tightened. 9 days later, Bay 4 caught fire at 2 in the morning. Electrical fault, they said. The equipment I'd moved was in Bay 7. Safe. Fully documented in the insurance claim as having been recently relocated, which I did, which meant the relocation was legitimate, which meant it looked like routine operations. And you, I said, and I had done exactly what he'd asked me to do and signed off on the movement logs. He looked at his hands. If I went to the investigators and said I thought it was intentional, The first thing they'd find was that I had personally moved the equipment out of the area that caught fire 9 days in advance on Vaughn Calder's direct instruction. I'd look like I was trying to explain away my own involvement. It was a clean trap. The kind that works because it uses the target's own actions against them. "When did Silas warn you?" I asked. "Day after the fire," Corbin said. "He came to find me at the facility. He didn't threaten me directly. He just said that the investigation was going to be thorough, and that anybody who had questions about anything they'd seen or done would be smart to think carefully about whether their questions were really questions, or whether they were just confusion about things they didn't fully understand." He said it flatly, reciting it the way you recite something you've repeated to yourself many times. I resigned 2 weeks later. I kept the photographs and the messages because I didn't know what else to do with them. He looked at the envelope on the table between us. "She told me her father would know what to do with evidence," he said. "She said you'd been doing it your whole life." I picked up the envelope. Outside, my phone buzzed on my hip. I had it out before the second pulse finished. "Thaddeus." One sentence. "They're going in." I drove back to the substation with Corbin's envelope on the passenger seat, and Thaddeus's 3 words still lit on my phone screen. "They're going in." I had spent 32 years at the edge of other people's emergencies. I had taken calls at 2 in the morning, coordinated responses to things that couldn't be undone, delivered information to families in the particular language you use when the facts are bad and you cannot change them. I had believed for most of that time that proximity to crisis without being inside it was manageable, that the professional distance was real and not just a thing you told yourself. I understood now that it was a thing you told yourself. When your daughter is the one inside it, there is no distance. There is only the 10-mile drive back to a conference room where you are going to sit and wait and have no control over anything that matters. I parked, went inside, and sat down. Agent Reyes had left a liaison officer, a younger agent named Pruitt, to keep me updated. He was conscientious and specific, which I appreciated, and he gave me updates every 15 minutes, which I also appreciated, even when the update was simply that the team was in position and waiting for the signal to move. At 6:47, my phone rang. Not Thaddeus. Not Vay. A number I didn't recognize, a Wisconsin area code, different from the one that had sent the coordinates. I answered immediately. "Mr. Rourke." A woman's voice. Young, slightly breathless. "My name is Dana. I work the evening shift at the Quick Mart on Route 42 outside of Crivets. I think I found something that might be yours." I sat forward. "Tell me. There was an SUV here earlier tonight, maybe 4 hours ago. A man came inside and bought 2 large coffees and a bag of chips. He was in the store maybe 6-7 minutes. When he left, I noticed something on the ground by the passenger's door." She paused. "It's an earring, small silver. Kind of unusual, it has this little compass rose on it." My right hand closed on the edge of the table. I knew that earring. I had bought the pair myself at a jewelry shop in Traverse City for Lenora's 30th birthday. She had opened the small box at dinner and held one up to the light and said they were perfect and meant it, which was not something she said about gifts she didn't mean. She had worn them consistently for 5 years. I had seen them on her 2 days ago at dinner. "Is it still there?" I asked. "I picked it up," she said. "I was going to put it in the lost and found, but then I pulled up the security footage to see if I could figure out whose car it came from, and I—" She stopped. "There's someone in the back seat. You can see them through the window. They're not moving around much. And the way the man was acting when he came in, like he was in a hurry, like he kept checking the door." "Don't touch the earring again," I said. Put it on a clean surface and don't let anyone else touch it. I'm going to give you a phone number and you're going to call it right now." I gave her Agent Pruitt's direct line. Within 20 minutes, the Wisconsin State Patrol had a unit at the Quick Mart on Route 42. The earring was photographed in place, documented and collected as physical evidence. The security footage was pulled a dark SUV Wisconsin plates, matching Silas Creed's registered vehicle. A figure visible through the rear passenger window, seated not moving with the voluntary quality of someone who had chosen to be there. Agent Pruitt showed me a still frame from the footage on his laptop. The figure in the back seat was too far from the camera and too obscured by the window's tint and the exterior lighting to identify by face. But the posture was specific. Knees together, shoulders drawn slightly inward. The particular stillness of someone who is holding themselves very carefully because the alternative is falling apart. I had seen Lenora sit like that once before, at her mother's funeral in the front pew 11 years ago. She had sat exactly like that for 2 hours, knees together, shoulders inward, absolutely still, because she had decided that if she moved, she would stop being able to control what happened next. "She's conscious," I said. Pruitt looked at me. "We can't confirm. She's conscious," I said again. "That's not how someone sits when they're not. That's how she sits when she's decided to hold on." He didn't argue. I thought about what it had taken. Silas at the counter for 6-7 minutes. The back seat door presumably unlocked from the inside, Vaughn, and Silas needed Lenora functional, needed her hands unbound, needed her capable of signing documents when the time came. That calculation, keep her intact enough to be useful, had given her a window. 6 minutes with her hands free and the door unlocked, and one small piece of jewelry she could work loose without making noise. She had taken the earring from her left ear. The compass rose. The one I had watched catch the light at her birthday dinner 5 years ago, while she said they were perfect. She had wedged it into the door seal with enough deliberateness that it would fall when the door swung open onto a surface where someone might see it, in a location with security cameras on a route that led directly to where she was being taken. My daughter had left a breadcrumb trail in the dark, using the only materials she had available. I excused myself from the conference room and walked to the men's room at the end of the hallway. I ran cold water over my wrists the way Margaret used to tell me to do when I came home from difficult cases she'd read somewhere that it helped regulate the nervous system, and I had always pretended to be skeptical because it was easier than admitting she was right about most things. I stood there for about 90 seconds. Then I dried my hands, straightened my jacket, and walked back down to the hallway. Agent Pruitt was on his feet when I came through the door. His radio was in his hand, and his face had the specific expression of someone receiving information that has just changed the shape of the evening. "Mr. Rourke," he said. "Vaughn Calder is on the phone. He says he wants to talk to you." Before I tell you exactly what I said, when Vaughn finally called me, and what happened in the 60 seconds after I finished saying it, leave a 1 in the comments if you've been with me this whole time. I want to know you're still here. What I'm about to share changed everything. Please note, portions of this story are fictionalized for educational and storytelling purposes. Names, places, and some details are not intended to reflect any specific individuals, but the lesson at the heart of it is one I hope you carry with you. Agent Pruitt held the phone toward me with 2 fingers. The way you hand someone something you're not entirely sure they should have. "They patched it through from the main line," he said. "He asked for you specifically." I looked at this phone, then I looked at Pruitt. "Is it being recorded?" "With your consent, yes." "You have it," I said. I took the phone. I did not put it to my ear immediately. I set it on the table in front of me, speaker facing up, and I sat down and pulled my chair in and put both hands flat on the table on either side of it. The same way I used to set up before a difficult deposition. You want your weight distributed. You want to feel the surface under your hands. It keeps you anchored when the other person is trying to move you. Then I picked it up. Vaughn, I said, a pause. Short, but real. He hadn't expected me to use his name first. Small thing. It told me he'd planned an opening and I'd already stepped slightly outside it. Gideon! His voice was controlled. Warm, even. The voice he used at dinner parties when he wanted someone to feel like the most important person in the room. I've been trying to reach you. I've been busy, I said. I imagine. Another pause. I want you to know that I understand why you're worried. Lenora's been going through a very difficult time, and I know how much you care about her. I do too. I said nothing. He continued. What happened last night, the argument we had, it got out of hand. Things were said. She was in a state that I haven't seen her in before, and I made some decisions in the moment that I wouldn't make now. I want you to know that. What decisions? I said, a slight hesitation. I called Silas. I asked him to take her somewhere she could calm down. Away from the house, away from me, somewhere neutral. I know how that sounds. But I was scared for her, Gideon. The things she was saying, the way she was behaving. Where is she now? I said. She's safe. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Silas has her somewhere safe, and when she's ready to come home. Where? I said. The warmth in his voice thinned slightly. Just slightly. I don't think it's productive for you to. Where is my daughter Vaughn? A longer pause this time. I could hear him recalibrating. The original plan, call the worried father, reassure him. By another 12 hours, wasn't sitting in the groove he'd cut for it. I wasn't responding the way a worried father responds. I was responding the way someone responds when they already know most of the answers and are asking questions to fill in the gaps. She's resting, he said finally. She needed space. She asked for space. She asked Silas for space. She asked me to give her time to think. Silas is a friend. I trusted him to. Vaughn, I said. I'm going to ask you one question, and I'd like you to think before you answer it. He waited. When Silas took her, did she have her phone? The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds. I counted them. 4 seconds is a long time to not answer a simple question about a phone. A man who didn't know his answer was dangerous would have filled that silence with something. Vaughn filled it with nothing, which told me he was smart enough to know the question was a trap, and not smart enough to know that the silence itself had already sprung it. She had her phone, he said. She dropped it at some point. It got damaged, and the phone she used to send me the coordinates. The silence this time was different. Shorter, sharper. The silence of a calculation happening in real time. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. I think you do, I said. I think you've known since about 2:15 this morning that something went wrong. I think you've been managing that problem for the last 18 hours, and I think you called me because you're trying to figure out how much I know. Gideon, I'm going to tell you, I said, because I think you deserve to understand where you are. I heard his breathing change. He was listening now in a different way. Not performing listening. Actually doing it. We have the USB, I said. All of it. The photographs, the financial records, the audio recording of you and Silas in your living room 8 months ago. We have Mrs. Finch's signed statement. We have the doorbell camera audio with Silas saying North Point before daylight. We have the traffic camera footage of his SUV leaving at 1:52. We have a witness at a gas station on Route 42 in Crivitz, Wisconsin, who found a compass rose earring in the parking lot 30 minutes after your vehicle passed through. We have security camera footage of your daughter in the back seat. I stopped. Let it sit. We have a federal kidnapping warrant, I said, because you crossed a state line, which means this is no longer a county matter, and it is no longer a state matter. The FBI is currently on the ground at this North Point warehouse. They went in 11 minutes ago. The silence on the other end of the line was total. It was the silence of a man who had built a very careful structure and was hearing piece by piece that every load-bearing wall had already been removed. Or Gideon now, he said. His voice was different now, quieter, the warmth entirely gone. What was left underneath it was something I recognized from 32 years of accident scenes, the flat-stripped register of someone confronting a reality they had genuinely not believed was possible. I want a lawyer. That's your right, I said. And it's a good decision. You should make that call immediately. I ended the call. I set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Agent Pruitt, who had been standing in the corner of the room with his arms crossed and his face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality that he was clearly working to maintain. "Did you get all of that?" I asked. "Every word," he said. I nodded. My phone buzzed on the table. "Thaddeus." I answered it. "They have her," he said. "She's alive and she's conscious. They're bringing her out now." I put the phone down on the table very carefully because my hands had started shaking and I did not want to drop it. And I sat there in that burned coffee conference room in a sheriff's substation in Harrows Mill, Michigan, and I pressed both palms flat against the table, and I breathed. I stayed at the table for a long time after Thaddeus's call ended, not because I couldn't move, because I needed a moment to let the words settle into something real. She's alive, and she's conscious. I had been operating for the past 19 hours on the assumption that those words were still possible, but assumption and confirmation are different things entirely. And the distance between them, the space where you don't let yourself feel anything, because feeling it might make you wrong, collapses all at once when confirmation arrives. My hands were still flat on the table. I looked at them. They had stopped shaking. Agent Pruitt came back into the room with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me without asking. It was the right thing to do. "They have her," he said. "I know," I said. "Thaddeus just called." He sat down across from me. Silas Creed was apprehended on the property. He did not resist. He paused. "Agent Reyes says your daughter was found in the rear storage room of the warehouse. She's been evaluated by the paramedics on scene. She has bruising on her wrists and 1 laceration on her left forearm. She's conscious and responsive and—" He stopped, looked briefly at his notes, looked back up. "She asked if you were okay." I pressed my lips together. Of course she had. "She asked if I was okay," I said. "Yes, sir." I picked up the coffee. It was bad coffee, the kind that has been sitting in a pot since the previous shift. But it was hot, and I drank it and did not notice the taste at all. "What's happening with Vaughn?" I asked. Pruitt set down his own cup. "He retained counsel within 20 minutes of your call ending. His attorney contacted the field office immediately and began the process of establishing his client's position. Vaughn is cooperating with the narrative that this was Silas acting independently, that he asked Silas to take Lenora somewhere to calm down, and was not aware that Silas intended to hold her against her will." "He's throwing Silas under the bus," I said. So that appears to be the current strategy, yes. I thought about Silas Creed, 41 years old, a man who had spent 20 years being Vaughn Calder's most useful asset, and was now discovering what assets are worth when the person who values them needs someone else to absorb the consequences. I did not feel sorry for him. He had known what he was doing, and he had done it anyway, and he had kept doing it long past the point where he could claim ignorance. But I understood the particular shock of finding out at the moment of maximum exposure that the person you trusted had been building a trapdoor beneath you the whole time. He won't hold, I said. Pruitt looked at me. Silas, I said. He won't hold to Vaughn's version. He's too smart to take the entire weight of this when he has leverage. I looked at the bad coffee in my hand. He kept something. People like Silas always keep something. Pruitt didn't respond to that. Probably because he wasn't supposed to confirm or deny what the federal investigators already suspected, and he was smart enough to know that not responding was itself a kind of response. At 8:43, Agent Reyes called the substation directly. Pruitt put it on speaker. Mr. Ork, she said. Your daughter is stable and is being transported to Marinette General for evaluation. She has been advised of her rights and has given a voluntary preliminary statement. The statement is consistent with the evidence we have. A pause. She also asked us to tell you that she's fine. Her word. She's not fine, I said. But she will be. Teeth agreed, Reyes said. There was something in her voice that had not been there during our earlier interaction. Not warmth exactly, but a slight unbuttoning of the professional register. A person acknowledging that what they were part of today had been something more than procedure. You'll be able to see her once she's been evaluated. The hospital is estimating 90 minutes. I'll be there in 70, I said. I'd prefer you take the full 90, she said. And drive the speed limit. There was a pause that functioned as a smile, and then she ended the call. Pruitt drove me. I didn't argue. My hands were fine, but I had been awake for approximately 19 hours and had driven a combined 3.5 hours in the rain and sat through more information than most people process in a week, and I was old enough to know the difference between being functional and being safe to operate a vehicle. We were on the highway heading south toward the Wisconsin border when Pruitt's radio crackled. He listened. His posture changed. Not dramatically, a slight straightening, a shift in how his hands sat on the wheel. What is it? I asked. He reached over and turned the radio volume down slightly. Silas Creed asked to speak with the lead investigator 40 minutes after being taken into custody. He kept his eyes on the road. He had a phone with him. A second phone, not his registered device. A prepaid unit. He glanced at me. He says it has messages on it. Messages from Vaughn. He says he wants to make a deal. I looked out the passenger window at the dark highway. The Wisconsin tree line moving past, in the headlights pine and birch wet from the earlier rain. The same trees I had driven past 19 hours ago, going the other direction, not knowing what I was driving toward. He kept something, I said. Pruitt said nothing. 20 minutes later, we crossed back into Michigan. The welcome sign appeared in the headlights and disappeared behind us. And I thought about Lenora in a hospital somewhere ahead, asking the paramedics whether her father was okay before she asked about anything else. And I thought about a prepaid phone in an evidence bag in a federal facility in Wisconsin. And I thought about the particular satisfaction of a careful man discovering that the people he underestimated had been more careful than he was. My phone buzzed. Thaddeus. A text, not a call. Vaughn's attorney just contacted me again. They want to discuss the possibility of cooperation in exchange for reduced exposure on the federal charges. Vaughn had lasted 4 hours before his lawyer told him the mathematics had changed. I put the phone back in my pocket and watched the road ahead. Marinette General Hospital was 40 minutes south. Lenora was in it. And in approximately 90 minutes, I was going to walk through the door of whatever room she was in, and I was going to stop at the threshold, and I was going to ask her one question before I did anything else. I had been thinking about that question since the moment I backed out of my driveway 19 hours ago. I knew exactly what I was going to say. Marinette General was a regional hospital, not large, not small, the kind of facility that handles what the county produces and refers out what it cannot. The parking lot was half empty at this hour. The emergency entrance was lit up in that particular shade of fluorescent white that makes everything look slightly more serious than it might otherwise be. Pruitt pulled up to the entrance and put the car in park. "I'll wait," he said. "You don't have to," I said. "See, I know," he said. He didn't move. I got out. The automatic doors opened and I walked into the smell of antiseptic and recycled air and the specific hum of a building that never fully sleeps. A nurse at the front desk directed me to the 3rd floor without asking for ID. Agent Reyes had apparently called ahead. The elevator was slow. I took the stairs. On the 3rd floor landing, I stopped. Not because I was winded. I have walked more stairs than most people half my age, and I was fine. I stopped because I needed 60 seconds the way I had needed 60 seconds outside Lenora's house 16 hours ago to look at what I was walking into before I started moving through it. Agent Reyes was waiting in the hallway outside the elevators. She had the look of someone who had coordinated a federal operation driven across a state line and was now standing in a hospital corridor on what was technically her own time because she had decided she wanted to be present for this part. "Before you go in," she said, "there are things you should know." "Tell me," I said. Silas Creed gave a full statement 1 hour and 12 minutes after being taken into custody. He waived his right to wait for counsel, which is... She paused. "Not a decision his future attorney is going to be pleased about, but it is what it is." She looked at me steadily. "He had a prepaid phone. Purchased 8 weeks ago at a gas station in Wausau, Wisconsin, under a name that is not his. He kept it in the wheel well of his SUV inside a magnetic key holder. He says he bought it the day after Vaughn told him the full plan, because he wanted insurance." "Smart," I said, "in a very limited way." "In a very limited way," she agreed. "The messages begin 6 weeks ago. Vaughn instructing him on timing on what to say to neighbors on the specific narrative to maintain if anyone asked questions. There is a message from 4 days ago detailing exactly what was supposed to happen last night. And there is a message from this morning sent at 7:43 a.m. after you had already left his house, in which Vaughn tells Silas to, and I'm quoting, directly handle the documentation problem before anything else surfaces. I looked at her. He was trying to destroy records while his wife was being held. While he was speaking to law enforcement about his missing wife, yes. She let that sit for a moment. The messages combined with the USB contents, the financial records, Corbin Shaw's testimony, and your daughter's own statement give us what we need. We executed a search warrant on the Harrows Mill property 2 hours ago. The laptop that was running when the warrant was served had 3 files open. 2 of them were financial documents. One of them was an email draft addressed to his accountant. Vaughn had been at his desk erasing things while Lenora was in a warehouse across a state line. That fact sat in my chest, in a way I did not try to name. "And your daughter," Reyes said, shifting her tone slightly. "Had something else with her." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced a small evidence bag. Inside it was a memory card, the kind used in digital cameras, no larger than a postage stamp. She had this in the insole of her left shoe. She removed her shoe and handed it to the paramedic before she agreed to be moved. She said, and again, I'm quoting, "Tell the investigator this one's for the fire." I looked at the evidence bag. Lenora had known even before she was found exactly which piece of the case was still incomplete. "What's on it?" I asked. "We're still processing," Reyes said. "But the preliminary review suggests photographs, interior shots of a warehouse space dated 8 months ago. Some of them appear to show accelerant placement patterns." She paused. "Your daughter documented the fire scene before the fire happened." I stood in the hallway and looked at the small evidence bag and thought about my daughter taking photographs in a warehouse, while her husband thought she was reviewing invoices because she had looked at the patterns and understood what they meant, and had known that one day someone would need to see what she had seen. She gets that from somewhere. Thaddeus had said it. I had not responded. I was not sure I could have. "There's one more thing," Reyes said. She looked at me with the directness I had come to recognize as her baseline mode of operation. "Vaughn Calder was taken into custody at 9:17 this evening. His attorney was present. He did not speak." She paused. "He's done." 2 words. The same weight as 3 words from Thaddeus 40 minutes ago. Different kind of weight. "Thank you," I said. Reyes gave me a nod that meant more than a nod usually means, and then she stepped aside. The hallway stretched in front of me. Room 314 was at the far end. The door was closed. Through the narrow window beside it, I could see the edge of a hospital bed and the glow of a bedside lamp and nothing else. I walked to the door. I stood in front of it for a moment, with my hand not quite touching the handle. Behind that door was my daughter, bruised, exhausted, processing something that would take months or years or possibly the rest of her life to fully integrate. Behind that door was the person I had spent 19 hours driving toward and waiting for and documenting and refusing to panic about, because panicking would not find her. I had told Pruitt in the car that I knew exactly what I was going to say. That was still true. I put my hand on the handle. I thought of Margaret briefly, the way I think of her at moments that matter not as grief, not anymore, but as presence. She would have been in that room already. She would have had Lenora's hand in both of hers before the ambulance doors finished opening. That was her way. Mine had always been different. I pushed the door open. Lenora was sitting up in the hospital bed. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone and a bandage around her right wrist, and she looked like someone who had been through something that would take time to name. Her hair was loose and there was a hospital blanket pulled up to her waist, and when the door opened, she turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes filled immediately. I stopped just inside the doorway. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. Then I asked her the only question I had come to ask. "Can I hug you?" Lenora's face broke. Not collapsed, broke the way something breaks, when the pressure holding it together is suddenly, finally no longer necessary. Her chin dropped. Her shoulders came forward. Her hands, which had been resting flat on the hospital blanket, with the careful stillness I recognized from 19 hours ago on a security camera screen, came up and reached toward me. I crossed the room. I sat on the edge of the bed beside her and put my arms around her, and she turned into me the way she had turned into me when she was 4 years old and frightened of thunderstorms, and the world was something she had not yet learned to manage alone. She pressed her face against my shoulder. Her whole body shook once hard like something releasing, and then she held on. I held on too. We stayed like that for a long time. I did not count the minutes. I did not look at my watch. There was nowhere else I was going and nothing else I needed to do. And after 19 hours of moving and thinking and documenting and waiting, the only thing left was this. Eventually, she pulled back. Not far. Just enough to look at me. Her left cheekbone was bruised in a deep wash of purple and green. The bandage on her right wrist was clean and white against her skin. Her eyes were red and wet and absolutely clear, the eyes of someone who has been through something terrible and is still undeniably themselves. "You came," she said. "You told me to," I said. She laughed. It was a short sound surprised out of her, and it cracked in the middle, but it was real. "I wasn't sure you'd remember. It had been so long. I remembered everything," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "He kept waiting for you to call. He said you would. He said you'd panic and I'd hear from you within the hour and then he could manage it." "I know. You didn't call. You told me not to." She reached up and pressed the back of her hand briefly against her eyes. "He thought he knew you." "He knew what he decided I was," I said. "That's different." She nodded slowly. Then she shifted against the pillow and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the one she got when she was working up to something she wasn't sure how to say. She had worn it at 9 years old when she broke a window playing with a baseball in the backyard. She had worn it at 22 when she told me she was leaving Michigan for her doctoral program. The expression of someone who respects the person they're talking to enough to be direct with them. "Dad," she said. The Toolbox code. Whose idea was it really? I looked at her. It was a question I had not expected at this particular moment in this particular room, and yet I understood immediately why she was asking it now rather than later. She had been turning it over, perhaps for hours, perhaps since the moment she sent the message, and understood in sending it how much weight a single sentence can carry across 24 years. "I always thought it was mine," I said. "But," I reached into my breast pocket. 3 days ago, when I was going through an old box of Margaret's things, I had never fully sorted, looking for a document I needed for something unrelated. I had found a letter I had never seen before. I had read it, folded it twice along its original creases, and put it in my breast pocket without knowing why. The way you carry things whose meaning you haven't found yet. I held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something old that you're not sure will hold together. Then she began to read. I watched her face as she read it. Lenora read slowly. Her lips moved slightly on the last line. Then she lowered the letter to her lap. "She wrote this to you," she said. "Yes," she said. Lenora stopped, swallowed. "She said you should teach me a sentence, something only the two of you would understand, so that if anything ever happened, I would know how to call you without saying it directly." "Yes," I said. This was her idea. "I didn't know that until 3 days ago," I said. "I thought I'd invented it myself. It felt like something I would do." I paused. It turns out it was something she would do. I just carried it out. Lenora looked down at the letter in her hands. The bruise on her cheek caught the light from the bedside lamp. Deep purple at the center, softer at the edges, already beginning the long process of fading. "She knew," Lenora said quietly. "Didn't she? Not about Vaughn, specifically. But she knew that the world is the way it is and that I might need—" She stopped again. Started again. "She gave me a way to reach you before either of us knew I would ever need it. That's what your mother did," I said. "She thought about the version of the future where things went wrong, and she made sure we were prepared for it." Lenora pressed her lips together. Her eyes filled again, but she held it the same way she held it at her mother's funeral, except this time she let one tear go, just one. She let it run down her cheek without wiping it and didn't seem to notice, She looked at the letter one more time. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it out to me. "Keep it," I said. She looked up. "She wrote it for you, too," I said. Even if she didn't know it yet, Lenora held the letter against her chest with both hands. Outside the window, the Wisconsin night had gone fully dark, and somewhere below in the parking lot, Agent Pruitt was sitting in a federal vehicle waiting to drive me back across the state line. And somewhere across that line, Vaughn Calder was in a room with lawyers and consequences, and the beginning of understanding what he had actually built. But in room 314 of Marinette General Hospital, none of that was the most important thing. My daughter looked at me over the top of her mother's letter, with her bruised face and her clear eyes, and she said she would have liked knowing it worked. I thought about Margaret, about the particular quality of her mind, practical and loving in equal measure, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always preparing for the contingencies nobody wanted to name out loud. "She knew it would work," I said. "That's why she suggested it." Lenora folded the letter carefully along its original creases and set it on the blanket beside her. For a long moment she looked toward the window. When she turned back to me, something in her expression had shifted, quieter, more careful. She had one more thing she needed to say. Lenora was quiet for a moment after the compass rose. Then she asked the question I had known was coming since the moment I walked through the door. "Dad." Her voice was careful, not accusatory. The voice she used when she was about to say something she had been turning over for a long time and had finally decided to say directly. "Before that night, did you know something was wrong?" I did not answer immediately. I owed her the truth, which meant I owed her the time to find the right words for it. "2 nights before," I said, "at dinner, you looked tired. Not work tired. The other kind." "I know the difference, too," she said. I asked if everything was all right. I said yes. "You did." I looked at my hands. "And I believed you. Not because I had a good reason to. Because I wanted to." I stopped. "That's not the same thing. I spent 32 years teaching myself the difference between what I wanted to be true and what the evidence said was true. And I sat across the dinner table from my own daughter, and I got it wrong." Lenora shook her head. "He was very good at it, Dad. He had years of practice making me seem fine." "I know that," I said. "It doesn't change what I should have seen." She looked at me steadily. "You came the same night I sent the code. 90 minutes in the rain at 2 in the morning. You didn't call, didn't panic, didn't do anything that would have made it worse." Her jaw tightened. "You did everything right when it mattered." "I want to tell you something," I said. "Something I found in the USB." She waited. I told her about Harrow Point Marine Holdings, the collision case 11 years ago. The 30-page report I had written, reviewed, signed, and submitted. The subordinate clause on page 14 about the mooring lines. The settlement I had helped close. I told her when the conference where she met Vaughn had been scheduled, 2 weeks after I filed that report. The agency where she worked. The jurisdiction over reopening investigations. I did not tell her it was certain. I told her it was possible. That a man who planned things carefully might have looked at a situation and seen an opportunity that had nothing to do with who she was. Lenora did not speak for a long time. The hospital room was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a cart moved past. The bedside monitor registered her pulse in small green peaks, steady and real. "But that's what the environmental work was," she said finally. Her voice had gone flat in the way voices go flat when a person is processing something at speed and keeping the surface still by effort. "He used to brag about it. that his wife was an environmental consultant. It made the company look clean. Lenora, no. She held up one hand. Not angrily, firmly. I need a minute. I gave her the minute. When she looked back at me, her eyes were dry. Something had moved through her face and settled into something harder and clearer. It doesn't change what I found, she said. The invoices, the fire, everything in that USB. I found that myself. He didn't plan for that. No, I said. He didn't. He thought he could predict what everyone around him would do. She looked at me. He was wrong about both of us. I reached over and put my hand over hers. That's not your fault, Dad, she said quietly. The case 11 years ago. You worked with what you had. I know, I said. But I'll carry it. Carry it quietly then, she said. Don't let it be the thing you give him. I looked at my daughter in the hospital bed, bruised and exhausted, and precise as she had always been, finding the exact right thing to say in the exact right way, the way her mother always had. You sound like her, I said. Lenora's expression softened completely. Just for a moment. Then the doctor knocked twice and opened the door, and the room became practical again, and I moved my chair back to give them space. But before I did, I looked at Lenora one more time. She was watching me with the same expression she'd had at 9 years old on that fence post at the fairgrounds, the one that said she had already decided to be okay and meant it, and was going to hold to that no matter what came next. Some things do not change. I was grateful for every one of them. 8 months is not a long time. It is long enough, though. Long enough for a federal investigation to move from warrant to indictment. Long enough for a man who built his reputation on being the most likable person in any room to discover that likability has a very short half-life once the financial records are unsealed. Long enough for a charter company whose books were held together by falsified invoices and a warehouse fire to stop existing as anything other than a line in a court filing. Vaughn was charged. The list was long. Domestic violence, unlawful restraint across state lines, conspiracy to tamper with evidence, wire fraud, insurance fraud. The warehouse fire investigation was formally reopened. Silas cooperated fully and still faced consequences because cooperation is not the same as innocence, and the law understands the difference even when people are surprised to find it does. I did not attend every hearing. It was not my case to watch. It was Lenora's life to reclaim, and I tried in those 8 months to remember that those two things were not the same. She moved into a rental near the lake. I offered her the spare room at my house once on a Tuesday in January, and she said, "No thank you, Dad," in the exact tone Margaret used to use when she had already made a decision and was being patient about explaining it. I did not ask again. I checked in. I did not check up. There is a difference, and I worked at it. She returned to her consulting work in the spring. She started going to a counselor in Petoskey on Thursday afternoons. She called me every Sunday, same as always, and she sounded different each time, not better exactly the way recovery is not a straight line, but more like weather moving through its own patterns, according to its own schedule. On a Thursday in late June, she came to visit. We sat on the back porch. The lake was doing what it does in summer, holding the light in a way that makes you understand why people build houses near water. We drank coffee and talked about nothing significant, a project she was consulting on, near Sleeping Bear, whether I had fixed the screen door yet, which I had not. At some point, she reached into her bag and set something on the table between us. A black metal toolbox, 12 inches long. Latching handle, the same one. I looked at it. Then I looked at her. She nodded once. I opened the latch. The USB was gone. The photographs were gone. The documents, the handwritten note, the key to the safety deposit box, all of it gone. The interior of the box was clean and empty except for one object sitting in the center. A brass key, single cut. Unremarkable except for a small paper tag looped through the bow with a piece of kitchen twine. I picked it up, turned the tag over. 2 words in Lenora's handwriting. My house. I looked up. I closed on it last week, she said. Small place, 2 bedrooms, south side of Harrow's Mill near the preserve. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. My name on the deed. Just mine. I held the key for a moment. 8 months ago, the black toolbox had meant 4 things. I'm not safe. Someone may be watching. Don't call back. Come find me. Today it meant something I did not have a code for. Something that did not need one. It's a good area, I said. Near the preserve. I know, she said. I looked for a while. We sat with that for a moment. The lake moved. A pair of mergansers worked their way along the shoreline unhurried. I still check the weather before you travel, I said. I know you do. I still think about whether your tires have enough tread. Dad. I'm aware it's a habit. It's fine. She almost smiled. Some things don't have to change. I closed my hand around the key. Then I set it back inside the toolbox and closed the latch and slid it across the table toward her. She looked at it, then at me. Keep it, I said. She picked it up, held it against her chest the way you hold something you have decided to keep. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The porch was quiet. The lake was there. The screen door that I still had not fixed creaked once in the wind and was still. My daughter had sent 12 words into the dark and trusted that I would understand them. I had. And on a porch in June with bad coffee and a screen door that needed fixing with the mergansers moving along the shoreline and the light doing what it does above the water, that was enough. That was everything. I am not a hero. I am a father who almost missed it. For years I told myself that staying quiet was the same as staying patient, that not asking hard questions meant giving my daughter space. I was wrong. If you are watching someone you love grow quieter and smaller, do not make my mistake. Ask the harder question. Believe them the first time. That is what Dad's revenge truly means. Not fury, but action taken at the right moment, with the right evidence in the right way. I believe God places certain people in our lives for the moments we cannot face alone. Love is not only presence. Sometimes it is preparation. A code word. A toolbox left in a garage. A compass rose that points home. For those of us in the adults 50-plus season of life, we carry decades of watching, listening, staying calm when everything inside us screams otherwise. That stillness is not weakness. That patience is not invisibility. Every real dad's revenge story ever told was built from exactly that kind of quiet strength. My personal belief is simple. The most dangerous person to underestimate is a parent who loves quietly. For every adult's 50-plus soul who has ever been dismissed or looked past, you are not invisible. You are precise. And for every dad's revenge moment still waiting to happen, trust yourself. Document everything. Move when the time is right. If this story moved something in, you leave a word in the comments below. Share it with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe and stay with us because every adult's 50-plus voice matters and more stories are coming. Thank you for staying with us until the very last word. These stories contain fictional elements crafted to carry real lessons. If this content is not right for you, step away, find what fits, and take good care of yourself and the people you love.